In 2025, Poland is celebrating a millennial milestone, because 1,000 years ago it got its very first king, Bolesław I, known as the Brave or Chrobry. But Poland didn't just magically pop into existence in 1025 with Bolesław on the throne. In fact, he'd ruled Poland for several decades before becoming king, but then he was considered a duke, considered by the Holy Roman Emperors to be a regional ruler under imperial authority, much like the dukes of Bavaria, Swabia, and even fellow Slavic Bohemia. For the Polish duke to be crowned king was, therefore, an extremely significant event full of meaning both inside and outside of Poland. So why did Bolesław do it? Why then? What did it mean for Poland and the empire? And why were there only 2 other kings of Poland after him for the next 250 years? Poland was fairly young by the time Bolesław came to power. Although the 12th century narrative of Gallus Anonymous, the anonymous Gaul, gives us a lineage of rulers, most of their deeds are considered legendary. The only one we can really confirm is Bolesław's father, Mieszko I, who seems to be the founder of what we could call Poland. In the 10th century, the lands east of the Oder River had been inhabited by West Slavic tribes, which had migrated there centuries ago. Around the middle of the century, though, archaeological data indicates that there was rapid expansion of a state based around the Middle Varta Valley, which would grow through conquest and pacts of allegiance to encompass the region later known as Greater Poland. This realm was ruled by Mieszko, mainly from his capital stronghold of Gniezno, and he and Bolesław would continue to expand it to encompass Pomerania, Silesia, Lesser Poland, and the Shervan towns. But this expansion didn't happen in a vacuum. Mieszko became embroiled in regional politics, power struggles, and frontier disputes, and in that complex web he would marry Dobrawa, the daughter of the Christian Duke of Bohemia, in 966, and himself convert to Christianity. This opened the door for stronger ties between Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, the medieval successor to the ancient Roman Empire, which encompassed Germany, Italy, and Bohemia. Bohemia's inclusion was the result of the empire's desire to spread its influence over the Slavic people to the east. The rest of the eastern frontier was ruled by margraves whose lands were ambiguously defined, which led to some conflicts with Mieszko as he pushed his influence west. But these margraves also came into conflict with the emperor Otto I, who was happy to confirm Mieszko's possessions up to the Oder River in exchange for Poland's submission as a tributary of the empire and ally of the emperor, beginning a long and complex relationship between Germany and Poland. Poland under Mieszko and Bolesław was an important regional power. Plunder from military campaigns and tribute traded for silver from the east and west made both of these dukes significant players in imperial politics, often siding with the Ottonian emperors against their internal rivals. Bolesław became duke on his father's death in 992, and a few years later, an event would take place which would have a huge impact on his reign. In 997, Adalbert of Prague, a Czech bishop exiled from his diocese due to a mix of unpopular reforms and the fact that his family were powerful rivals of the Bohemian dukes, came to Bolesław's court and gained his support to try and convert the pagan Prussians just beyond Poland. Conflicts between the Prussians and the missionaries led to Adalbert's execution, and Bolesław, motivated either by strategic interest, genuine piety, or possibly both, ransomed the cleric's remains from the Prussians and had him buried in his capital of Gniezno. Adalbert's death under these circumstances made him a martyr, and a shrine was erected over his tomb, without it being long before he was widely considered a saint. Now this brings us to Otto III, the young emperor who was growing to be an ambitious and deeply religious ruler. He'd also been a strong supporter and friend of Adalbert, and in the year 1000, he made a pilgrimage to his shrine in Gniezno. Here he met with Bolesław, and was received quite warmly. But exactly what happened next has been debated so extensively that you could fill a library with all the works that have been written about it, largely because of the differences in what the sources discussing the event do and don't say. What is agreed is that Otto and Bolesław swore some sort of pact of friendship, bringing Poland and the empire to the closest they'd ever been. There were also exchanges of gifts, with Bolesław offering several retainers to Otto, as well as the arm of Saint Adalbert, while Otto gave Bolesław a replica of the Holy Lance, which was part of the imperial regalia. Bolesław's son, the future Mieszko II, was also betrothed to Otto's niece, Richeza of Lotharingia. Otto also had Gniezno elevated to become an archbishopric, with 3 new sees in Wrocław, Kraków, and Kolberg being created subject to it, and made Adalbert's brother, Gaudentius, the first archbishop. This meant that with the exception of Poznan, Poland's first and previously only diocese, the whole Polish church was independent from the German churches. Otto also declared that any new pagan lands which Bolesław might conquer would also be subject to Gniezno. That's what everyone more or less agrees on. What's debated is Gallus Anonymous's claim that during the proceeding, while the 2 rulers exchanged vows of friendship and cooperation, Otto supposedly placed his imperial diadem onto Bolesław's head and elevated him to the title of king. Gallus is the only one who mentions this, and he may very well be doing so to give extra legitimacy to the Piast dynasty, the dynasty which would rule Poland until the 14th century. He was, after all, the first to write a Polish history under Polish patronage, though his narrative isn't always entirely reliable. He might have been influenced in his description by the coronation of Stephen I of Hungary the following year in 1001, with which Otto was likewise involved, and Hungary also received its own archbishopric. But in any case, whether as king or not, Bolesław was definitely elevated in some fashion. The contemporary chronicler Thietmar of Merseburg, who was rather hostile to Bolesław, asks God to forgive Otto for, quote, making a lord out of a tributary. Even if Otto didn't make Bolesław a king, or declare his intent to make him a king, his elevation of Bolesław definitely set the foundation for his later coronation and anointing in 1025. That's without a doubt. So why would Otto do this? Make a lord out of a tributary? Well, Otto III had a lot of ideas about reforming the empire, renovatio imperii. After the conquest of Gniezno, Bolesław seems to have accompanied him to Aachen, where the emperor exhumed the remains of Charlemagne as part of a wider attempt to have the first Holy Roman Emperor canonized as a saint. And he apparently gifted the golden throne on which Charlemagne's body was seated to Bolesław as well. Otto also seems to have contemplated at some point moving the imperial capital to Rome, but abandoned that idea after realizing how many political issues that might cause. But most importantly for our purposes, Otto seems to have seen the Slavic lands in the east as a more integral part of the empire, not just tributaries on the frontier. So, Bolesław's elevation would have been a further integration of Poland into the empire, granting it equality in its political culture and traditions. But it was also a practical matter. Poland was quite simply a very powerful political entity on the empire's frontier, and guaranteeing friendship was a wise act. And of course, we can't underestimate the religious dimension either. Otto was a strong supporter of missionary activity, and the way he granted Poland religious autonomy and authority over the spread of the church into the east was a way of encouraging that sort of activity. Even Poland itself was only newly converted, and it had few actual churches, since Mieszko I doesn't seem to have done much to spread the faith. Bolesław was a lot more enthusiastic, and although the Christianization of Poland would remain slow, long focused mostly on urban centers and the elite, Otto likely believed that an autonomous church focused on evangelization and backed by a ruler pious enough to properly honor a missionary martyr like Adalbert would be able to do a better job at bringing its people and its neighbors into the Christian fold. And there may have been a dozen other factors at play as well. Jonathan Shepherd, for example, argues that this may have been in response, at least partially, to the growing ties between the Byzantine Empire and Kievan Rus. And this might have been sort of a means of countering the growing power of Vladimir the Great. I'm mostly talking about the relationship with the empire in the West in this video, but Poland also had important relationships with Kiev, and Bolesław did also involve himself in Kievan politics. So, okay, Otto III elevated Bolesław in some way in the year 1000. In his view, Poland was to become this sort of missionary eastern branch of the empire. But whatever Otto intended, it was cut short by his early death in 1002 from a fever while he was in Italy. He was only 21, and his fiancée, the Byzantine princess Zoe, had just disembarked in Apulia and was on her way to meet him. Since Otto had no direct heir, the great lords of the empire discussed and negotiated who would succeed him. If you're interested, I've made a whole video about how this sort of thing worked at the time. Ultimately, it would be Henry II who would be chosen, though not without conflict. Bolesław, along with various Saxon lords, would publicly assent to Henry's rule at a council at Merseburg in 1002. But their relationship went downhill from there. Between Henry going back on certain promises about lands to be granted to Bolesław between the Elbe and the Oder, an ambush of Bolesław after he left the council at Merseburg, which Henry may or may not have been involved in, though Bolesław certainly believed that he was, and finally Bolesław's intervention in a succession crisis in Bohemia in 1003, where he usurped the ducal throne and refused to pay homage to Henry for it, their relationship soured to the point where Henry and Bolesław were almost constantly at war for most of Henry's reign. Even after hostilities formally ended in 1018, they remained rivals. But it was only with Henry II's death in 1024 that Bolesław was finally able to crown himself king the following year. Christian kingship at the time had lots of symbolic meaning, and there were specific requirements for the creation of new kings, including papal assent in order for the idea of divinely sanctioned rule to be valid. But the popes wouldn't have allowed Bolesław to be crowned without Henry's approval, since Rome was still subject to the empire, and the emperors were still seen to have a theoretically universal secular authority. Bolesław had definitely seen himself as a king before this, though, as seen, for example, by the fact that we have coins of his dated to sometime between 1005 and 1015, where he's called Rex Boleslavus, Rex being Latin for king, likely using his elevation by Otto III as justification for his special status, and it's clear that he was effectively a king in all but coronation before 1025. All he needed was for Henry to be out of the way for him to make it official. The succession of the next emperor, Conrad II, was just as messy as Henry's, and Conrad was still fighting his German rivals well until the end of 1025, not to mention his campaign into Italy, which would distract him for the next 2 years until his imperial coronation in Rome in 1027. So Bolesław had the perfect chance to be crowned King of Poland while nobody could really oppose him. On top of this, 1024 also saw the installation of a brand new pope, John XIX, who may have, for whatever reason, been more willing to support Bolesław's kingship. Some have pointed out that he is known to have accepted bribes, but whether this was the case here is unknown. He was also the brother of the previous pope and hadn't even been a member of the clergy before being chosen to succeed him, so he might have simply had different points of view. And, like I said, he didn't exactly have an established emperor to influence his decision. But what did it even really mean for Bolesław to be king? Why did he bother going through all this effort to be crowned at all? One might look further on in Poland's history and see how it wound up becoming independent of the Holy Roman Empire and say, well, this. Bolesław wanted to assert Poland's independence as a separate Christian kingdom. Contrast this with Bohemia, which remained part of the empire for centuries, even once its rulers were granted the title of king by the emperors later on. But the reality may be a little bit more complicated than that. You see, by this point, it was already believed that the imperial title was above that of kings, and that kings and kingdoms could be subject to the empire. And Bolesław was far from hostile to the empire itself. His wars with Henry were not wars of independence, but wars of imperial politics. He sought to affirm his possession of imperial lands which Henry had promised him as part of Bolesław's support for the emperor's election. And when he fought against Henry, he often did so as part of larger factions of German lords who opposed the emperor. Bolesław played a central role in these factions because he was likely the most powerful member, but he was acting no differently than any other prince of the empire. His coronation in 1025, then, might better be seen as a way to reaffirm the special position which Bolesław held within the empire. That special position may be a confirmation of how Bolesław himself saw his own elevation by Otto III in the year 1000, whether Otto actually declared him a king or not. But as a king, Bolesław would rank above other dukes, counts, and margraves, and might be more similar to the kings of West Francia, or France. Now, today we see France and the empire as completely separate states, but in the 10th century, German rulers, especially once they started holding the title of emperors, had a great deal of influence over their neighboring kingdoms, and Otto I regularly stepped in to settle disputed royal successions and bishop elections in France and Burgundy. Poland would probably be more closely tied to the empire than France was, especially as the 11th century saw a hardening of the limits of the empire in the west, but King Bolesław would nonetheless maintain an elevated and unique position on its eastern frontier. with a more equal, or at least lateral, relationship to the emperor. But being a king also had implications for Bolesław's relationship with his own subjects, implications which may have been equally, if not more, important for him. You see, Slavic traditions tended to support rulers who were more overlords over various localized tribes with their own more local hierarchies. The degree of control was more loose, based around tribute and gift exchange, and concentrated around centers of power, which is why Mieszko I established various strongholds like Gdansk in eastern Pomerania. In contrast, the Germanic Christian understanding and ideology of kingship that had developed by the beginning of the 11th century supported a much more centralized rule. Now, this ideology still had room for local powers and also placed a good deal of importance on gift exchange. This wasn't a modern centralized state. But compared to the native Polish ideology, a medieval Christian king was supreme over his kingdom. He was, in theory, the final arbitrator of law and all disputes in his realm. Those local rulers ruled with his permission, just as he ruled with the permission of God, so he had far more right to intervene. There was also only one king. In contrast to the Slavic tradition, where sons were expected to share in the succession, the Christian king could ensure that authority remained in the hands of one heir, especially important to Bolesław, who felt the need to exile his half-brothers and stepmother when he came to power in order to avoid competition. A king was also in charge of the church in his realm, which is why the independence of the Polish church that came in 1000 was such an important stepping stone towards Polish kingship. The archbishop was his partner in rule, in charge of the church while the king took care of secular affairs. But the king was still principally in charge of the spiritual well-being of his subjects, and the archbishop was his arm for doing so. And given the role which Otto III himself had granted Bolesław, that of spreader and guardian of the faith in the East, Bolesław could easily argue for a need for this kind of authority. To him, his anointment and coronation in 1025 was likely the necessary conclusion of that process which had started at Gniezno in 1000. But, of course, not every emperor was as enthusiastic about such a special position for Poland as Otto III had been. As we've seen, Henry II was clearly an obstacle to Bolesław's coronation, though he had several reasons for it. But even his successor, Conrad II, doesn't seem to have been a fan. For some, the coronation was seen as a usurpation of power from the emperor, a bold move by an unruly vassal who was getting dangerously close to slipping out of the emperor's control, or maybe even inverting their traditional power dynamic. Conrad's biographer, Wipo of Burgundy, writes that Bolesław's coronation was in injuriam regis Conradi, at the injury of King Conrad. King here because he wasn't yet crowned emperor by the Pope. Bolesław's audacity was divinely punished, though, by his death a few months later. Oh, yeah, I probably should have mentioned, Bolesław died on the 17th of June, 1025, only a few months after his coronation. That's why we can only really make educated guesses as to what his plans and ambitions were as king. But his son, Mieszko II, or Mieszko Lambert, was also crowned king on Christmas of the same year, and continued in his father's footsteps. He too was involved in imperial politics, allying himself with Conrad's rivals like Duke Ernst II of Swabia and Friedrich II of Upper Lotharingia, and marching armies against the emperor in two separate campaigns between 1028 and 1030. But the emperor wasn't the only one unhappy with the situation in Poland. As I said before, the idea that one heir should inherit everything went against native custom. And although Mieszko inherited the kingdom because he was his father's favorite, he had two brothers, Bezprym and Otto, who weren't happy about being left out. They turned to Emperor Conrad on one end and Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince of Kiev, on the other for help, both of whom were interested in cutting Poland down to size. And in 1031, both invaded and forced Mieszko II into exile. Ah yes, Poland's greatest weakness, its neighbors agreeing to invade it at the same time. Bezprym then ruled briefly, though significantly he was never crowned, and he sent the Polish royal insignia to Conrad. He had some disagreements with the Polish aristocracy, though, and wound up being killed in 1032. Conrad then agreed to return Mieszko to the throne, but he had to publicly renounce all pretensions of kingship, and Poland would be divided into three parts between him, his brother Otto, and a cousin of theirs. Mieszko would ultimately rule over Poland alone once again, Otto died soon after, and Mieszko was able to take over his brother's territory and depose their cousin. But he never regained the position he had at the start of his reign, and he too died shortly after in 1034. Sources differ as to whether from natural causes or a similar fate to Bezprym. What's significant, though, is that Konrad's actions were clearly an attempt to rein in Poland. He stripped its rulers of royal titles to restore the right order of things, and when Mieszko returned, there was a conscious attempt at diminishing Polish power by splitting up the realm. And Poland remained in this blurry position for a long time, where its relationship to the empire was sort of ambiguous. Despite Konrad's accomplishment, the empire could never assert enough power over Poland for it to be fully integrated. Poland was never to become a second Bohemia. But Poland couldn't fully tear itself away from the empire either, assuming it even wanted to, and kingship had a hard time sticking. Bolesław II was crowned king in 1076 as a reward by the Pope for his assistance against Emperor Henry IV during the investiture conflict. But internal opposition to Bolesław II's methods and heavy-handed rule led to rebellion in 1079 and ultimately his deposition, exile, and death. Between internal reluctance to accept the implications of a king ruling over the state and the eventual division of Poland into several duchies under different branches of the Piast dynasty, there wouldn't be any new kings for quite some time, even as the empire's direct influence waned. It was only in 1295, over 200 years after the last king's reign, that a Polish ruler would once again be crowned king, in a world, and a Poland, much different from that of Bolesław I. Poland's first crown emerged out of a complex set of circumstances tied to its relationship with the Holy Roman Empire and Bolesław's desire to rule according to the contemporary Christian ideology of kingship. It was his relationship with Otto III, his reverence for the martyr Adalbert, and Otto's own ideology, which allowed for Poland's elevation in the year 1000 and got Poland its own archbishop. And it was all of those things, plus the right political circumstances, that allowed for Bolesław to be anointed and crowned king. It might not have lasted, but it certainly played an important role in Poland's trajectory thereafter. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I've got sources and recommendations listed in the description below for anyone who's interested in learning more. As always, I thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.